in chronic pain. And so I can tell when it's going to rain days, sometimes weeks ahead of time. And so before we had weather forecasters, having someone in the family unit who could tell when storms were coming would have been very valuable person to have in the community. But that was kind of forgotten when we switched to agriculture, because agriculture is about finding the one best example and then replicating that example everywhere. And I believe that that came from agriculture and then was switched to people, and that we felt that there was one kind of way to be, and that some of our early religions kind of took that and manipulated others and forced their beliefs and forced others to kind of to take those beliefs on. And so, for example, in Native American traditions, before the Christian missionaries came, having a disability, if you had a family member that had a disability, your family was considered to be fortunate. Just like if you were fortunate enough to have a family member that was transgendered, your family was seen as being lucky, and that Mother Nature had bestowed fortune upon you. But when the Christian missionaries came, they did away with those beliefs. And I think that religion can be a wonderful thing, but that those moments are when it's at its worst. And so what happened is then in the Hellenistic era, we see the idea that that gods are perfect, and that the expression of godliness is to be perfect and unblemished. And yet at the same time, we have gods like Hephaestus, who had a disability. And so there's an acknowledgement that disability exists, but it's kind of put into the shadows. And yet there are burials during that time period of people who were buried with prosthetic limbs, because they were proud of them and they were part of who they were in their identity. So we see this kind of juxtaposition where people with disabilities were excluded from the social sphere and looked down upon, but at the same time, disability was a part of daily life and people's daily experiences. Now, the Spartans, they viewed disability as a crime against society. And so being born with a disability was a capital offense. And if parents hid that they had a child born with a disability, then that was also a crime punishable by death. And yet there are still stories of parents risking their lives to raise children in secret. And so even when the state says, on pain of death, you must not raise a child with a disability, there are stories of parents doing the opposite. And so there are even stories of children being left in reed cribs and sent down the river to avoid being killed by groups that were sent by community leaders. And so when we get to Roman times, we see that people with disabilities were really dehumanized and discredited, even though while people like Julius Caesar had epilepsy. And so to the entrance to Rome, they used to have someone named John the Stutterer. He was always named John the Stutterer, but it was a person who was blind. And they would keep him in an oversized bird cage. And when people would approach, he would hear them and beg for food. And that was considered entertainment. And so the first three popes continued that practice, and they held somebody named John the Stutterer in a bird cage to as entertainment for travelers that came to visit the Pope. And in Protestantism, what we see is that Martin Luther said that children born with disabilities were possessed by demons and should be killed. And there's evidence that John Calvin actually drowned some babies of his parishioners who he believed were possessed by demons. And that comes to kind of the crux of the question, right? Why do bad things happen to good people, right? So, maybe one, they're not good, right? So that's the idea that they're possessed by a demon, right? That the reason why they have a disability is because they deserve it, because they've committed some sin, or that their suffering is a divine expression of God's love. So it's sort of these two opposite kind of ideas. But what happens is that if disability is because people suffer out of God's love, then what happens is there isn't as much of a focus on helping people to suffer less, because the idea is that they're suffering because God commands it and God wishes it. And a lot of these things come out of what I believe is misunderstandings of the Bible. I'm a really big fan of just ignoring Leviticus because really nobody makes it out. But in Leviticus, it says that no one who's blind or has arms that are too long, which I guess I'm still okay, is allowed in the temple or is allowed to give offerings to God. And so people have interpreted that as being that people with disabilities are sinners and worth less as human beings. In Luke verse 5, chapter 5, verse 18 through 26, the crippled sinner is lowered by helpful do-gooders, and Jesus absolves him of his sins and says, "Get up and walk and sin no more." In John at the pool in Bethesda, again, Jesus heals a man and helps him walk and says, "Do nothing worse, sin no more, so that nothing worse happens to you." But then there's also in John, there's an experience where Jesus is walking with the apostles, and they pass a man who's a beggar, who's blind. And Matthew asks, is this man blind because of his sin or the sin of his father? And Jesus says, neither. He is blind so that the majesty of God can be revealed to him, right? So this is a different kind of take on disability, that maybe through the experience of having disability, that something about God might be revealed to this person, and so that they shouldn't be pitied or scorned, but in fact appreciated because of their experience. And so I've always really liked that that verse in the Bible. Another verse that people with disabilities point to is after Jesus' crucifixion, when he comes before his friends and they think he's a ghost, and he shows them his wounds, and he invites them to feel them, to touch them. And that flies in the face of the taboo of illness and disability, that it should be ignored or not looked at or turned away. Jesus is inviting his friends to feel his wounds and to experience them. And I've always thought that for me that this meant that's how God knows us is by our wounds, is by what we might call imperfections, but to God is how we were made, how we're supposed to be. Um, so I asked my dad once why was I given a disability? Why did God make me the way that He made me? And he told me, he said, Matt, I think it's because you're a test. I think that the way that people look at you says very little about you, but speaks volumes about them. And he told me that when people meet you, that, when you ask for help, that you're giving them the opportunity to be their best self. You're appealing to their better angels. And that when we help others, that we can become our best selves. And so he told me to never feel bad about asking for help, because I was giving people that opportunity. And in my life, I've gotten a huge amount of help. I cannot make it through a day without the help of others. And for me, that help are miracles. I find miracles in the mundane. And my life has been saved by strangers. I remember I was in grad school, and I was coming home from a study session, and I slipped and fell in front of my apartment building, and I hit my head pretty bad. And it was a cold night, and I cried out for help. And this couple approached me that was dressed in the nine, they must have been on their way out. And I asked them for help, and the man stepped over me and kept walking. And soon after, these three men came to my aid. They didn't speak any English. The first man, he picked up my head off the cold cement, and he held it gently, and he prayed for me. And one of the men left, and soon he returned, and I heard the ambulance coming. And when they got me in the back, I said to the paramedic, I want to thank those three men. And the ambulance driver told me that as soon as they got me in the ambulance, they took off because they were illegal. And so when people say that, the illegal immigrants are the problem, it really bothers me, because when I need help, that it's the people who we're often told by authority are the problem, are the people who were the first to come to my aid. Another time, taxi dropped me off at the wrong address, and it was dark, and there was nobody around that I could see, and cabs were coming by, and but they wouldn't stop. I kept trying to hail one, and this woman that was across the way, who was 6'5" with 8-inch heels, jumped in front of a taxi and said, "If you don't take this guy home, I'm going to put my heel through your tire." And so don't tell me that LGBTQ people are not part of God's plan. Because if those women hadn't come to my aid, I don't know what I would have done. And so, the thing that really disturbs me is that when people, they think they know the will of God, and that means that they have a right to judge other people and to hold them to a higher standard than they hold themselves. When in my experience, the very people that we're told or should be marginalized, or who aren't as good, are the very people who are the first to come to my aid. And I think about the people that that Jesus chose to surround himself by. They were outcasts and people on the margins. And I think that there's a reason for that, that when others deny your humanity, that it just makes you want to be as human as you possibly can. Um, and so, that's my experience with needing help. But I think that when um, we take a leap of faith in one another and we commit ourselves to a cause greater than ourselves, that we're able to accomplish incredible things. And I learned this with Dr. Watts. When I was a small child, every doctor we met said that I would never walk. And Dr. Watts said that he would give it a try. And that first surgery was just supposed to take 2 hours. He was just going to open me up and look around and close me up and give my parents a report. And 8 hours later, I came out with a joint that worked, and that could get me up and walking. And Dr. Watts came out, and the first thing he said to my parents was, "I can't believe what I just did." And Dr. Kaplan, who was there at the time, to this day calls that surgery the miracle. But Dr. Watts took a leap of faith and he tried. And his goal was to help a young boy get up on his feet. And so I've learned that when we commit ourselves to a cause greater than ourselves, that we're able to truly achieve our best self. And I think that we can learn a lot about the human condition and what God's intention is from science and psychology and cosmology. And so we look at cosmology. Cosmologists say, if you give us one miracle, the Big Bang, we'll explain everything else, right? But they can't explain the Big Bang. They also say that if the value of gravity were a trillionth of a percentage off from what it is, that we wouldn't have stars or galaxies or anything like that. A trillionth of a percent off. And no scientist believes that you can just do that randomly first shot out. So, I think that shows just how precise and how vast creation is. And if you look at biology, what we can determine is that diversity pleases God, right? God has thought up every type of life on planet Earth possible, and that you can't find a spot on this planet where life doesn't exist. And so I think instead of saying that we have to only one thing is the valuable thing, that we have to understand that diversity in the world and diversity in humanity pleases God, right? And also from cosmology, what we can tell is that every one of us, each one of you, me, is 16.4 billion years in the making. In order for you to exist, entire galaxies had to be born, lived, and died. We're literally made of stardust. If that's not a miracle, then I don't know what is. And from genetics, what we know is that every person on this planet descends from the same 200 breeding pairs. So we all come from the same 400 people. Now, a single a troop of chimpanzees has more genetic variation than all of humanity combined. So what that means is that there is no person on this planet that is any more distant from you than a cousin. And so we need to come together as a people, as a planet, because that's how we're going to deal with coronavirus and with global warming and all of those things. And I believe that the great holy books are part of a puzzle, that they're not fully written, and that it's our own experiences and our own stories that fully complete the story. And that but we need to do more than just hear one another. We need to experience life the way that others experience it for a little while. And so when we hear each other's stories, it opens up a door. And so I invite all of us to walk through that door. What what would church service be like if we had no light, right? If we just did it in darkness, the way that my blind brothers and sisters do, or we did it without sound, or if we worship the way that they worship in a small African village. We can learn from experiencing life the way that others live it, and that there are many paths, and that we shouldn't be afraid of other people's paths or other religions, but instead that we should embrace them because they can tell us more about our own story, and about ourselves. And I'm a therapist. I love being a therapist because people come to me and talk to me, and I don't have to judge them. It's not my job to judge. And when you don't judge others, you can understand where their story came from, why they made the decisions that they made, even if you don't agree with them as a person. Um, but when you understand how they got there to make that decision, you can understand them, and so there isn't that anger. And so I wonder if that's what God is like a little bit, that God understands how we got to the decisions that we've made, and so God understands that. And when I was young, I had a surgery that was really painful, and 4 times a day, my leg had to be broken. And after the first month of this, I had gotten to my wits' end. And one day, I found myself alone in the hospital bed, and I asked that age-old question of Job, you know, Lord, please just take a little bit of this pain away. And when it didn't get better, I cursed God. I couldn't understand what a small child had done to be worthy of such pain. And then I started apologizing. I thought, well, then if I hadn't committed a sin before, I certainly committed a sin now. And so then I started really getting upset. But then I realized I felt God's presence in the room, and I felt God weeping. God was crying with me. God felt my pain. God knew my pain. This was not a God of short temper and thin skin who was angry that I cursed his name. This was a God that was in pain with me. And years later, I learned that the way that the mind works is that if we believe that our pain is being caused on purpose by someone who wants us to be in pain, then our brain actually intensifies the pain signal. But if instead we believe that it hurts the person causing us pain as much as it does for us feeling the pain, our brain dials down that signal, and we actually feel less pain. So when I went from feeling that God was punishing me and causing me pain to feeling that God was weeping with me, my pain actually got less. My prayers were actually answered. And what I realized from that is that God doesn't have an ego. I think the reason why angels are often depicted as babies is because God can be defenseless. God can be fragile because God doesn't have an ego. and God weeps with us when we struggle. I think it's like a child, that's learning to ride a bike, and the parent doesn't want to let go because they don't want that child to fall, but they know that if they don't let go, that child's never going to be able to ride the bike on their own, right? And I don't believe that there's a silver lining to being pain, me being in pain. I don't think that God gave me pain so I could, realize something. But instead, I believe that God gave me the choice that I could allow the pain to turn me bitter and angry, or I could try and learn from it to help other people. And sometimes in those moments of helping other people, I've actually been helped. I got to work with a 3-year-old little girl who was an incredible person, and she impacted everyone she met immensely. And when she was close to dying, she gave her parents her favorite teddy bear because she said she didn't want them to be sad and that she didn't need it where she was going to be going. And normally, everyone says that you can't hypnotize somebody under the age of 4. The brain isn't developed enough. But this little girl allowed me to hypnotize her and allowed me to take away some of her pain at the very end of her life. And I will never forget that gift that she gave me of allowing me to give her a little piece at the end. And, you know, everyone wished that she could have been around today, but you can't tell me that God wasn't working through her and a part of her, and that God didn't love her because she died from cancer. Um, and she gave me a great gift. And I could sit here for hours and tell you about stories. I'll just share one more. I was waiting to get a new electric wheelchair, and I was in this waiting room, and there was a woman seated in a wheelchair, and she kept singing the same verses over and over. These two lines from a hymn, just over and over and over again. And she was clapping and just joyous and just giving everything she had into it. And so I was just sitting there watching, and then this man was wheeled in a wheelchair, and his mother and his nurse were there, and the right side of his skull was missing, and he was in such spasm that he was punching himself he was making a fist and hitting himself, and his nurse and his mother was trying desperately to stop this. And then he heard the woman singing, and he saw her, and this huge smile came over his face, and all the tension drained out of his body, and he stopped hitting himself. And I was in shock. And the woman, she didn't skip a beat. She just kept singing. And it was like this is what she had been waiting for the whole time. She wasn't surprised or shocked at all. And I swear to you, there was a warm light over both of their faces, and I could not for the life of me find its source. But honestly, I didn't look for very long. I was just in awe of this experience. And I've seen things like that so many times in my life that I can't believe that it was just a random coincidence. And there's one more thing about the brain is that there's what's called the chocolate bar scale. And so there's a chemical that the brain produces called dopamine when we're happy or when we're anticipating a reward. And so if you eat a chocolate bar, it releases a certain amount of dopamine. And so they use this scale to see when they're studying human happiness. And so what they've discovered is that if somebody gives you $1,000, that's worth about 150 bars of chocolate as far as how much dopamine it creates. But if you help somebody, it starts at 2,500 blocks of chocolate and goes up from there. So the way the brain is designed is that the key to happiness is not just getting money, it's helping others. And what they found is that you can actually plot happiness and income, and that it's a bell curve, so that people who are billionaires, the richest people in the world, are about as happy as the poorest people in the world. So one of the reasons why you see people like Bill Gates and other people giving their money away and trying to do good in the world is that's a wonderful thing, and that's great, but they're also chasing their own happiness. Because if they don't do that, their money will never be fulfilled. And I think that that's also a demonstration of God's intention for us, and that if you can make capital, that's wonderful, but you need to use some of it to help others. Um, and that's the way the brain is set up, which I always thought was pretty cool. Well, maybe if I can keep talking, but maybe if people have questions, if you want to just kind of unmute and ask your question, then mute so we don't have that um, feedback again. Yes. I can't hear you.
Now. Okay.
Okay, now we hear you.
I'm invisibly disabled. Madness is a disability, and I'm bipolar. Depression is a disability, and it's invisible except when it goes to its extremes. It's definitely a disability.
Definitely.
So could you comment on invisible disability?
Sure. So invisible disability is a whole other kind of section of discrimination, because for me, it's easy to see that I have a disability, so it's easy to make accommodations. But if it's not obvious, then yet spend half your time fighting to be acknowledged for the disability that you have. And part of it is in the religious disability community, we say that if people sin and institutions are made of people, then institutions sin. And in the way that institutions sin is in institutional bias. So, and it affects all of us subconsciously. So we all hold views and ideas that we've inherited from generations before that make us feel that that other people that might not behave the way that we do, or might, we might see them as other, instead of understanding that it's part of the variation of the human condition, right? There are a lot of amazing artists and amazing engineers that have bipolar throughout history, and that if you look at many of the great revolutions in thought or technology or art, they've come from people who aren't neurotypical. And so in today's day, we have so much pressure that we all have to think the same and learn the same. And if we can't learn the same, then we're not as smart, right? People, when my dad was growing up, when he was a kid, people told him he wasn't smart because he had a learning disability. My dad's one of the smartest people I've ever met. So if we just limit and say, well, there's only this kind of intelligence and there's only this kind of way to be, then we close ourselves off from this amazing diversity and just the rainbow of life. And I think that God created us differently because humanity is like a jigsaw puzzle, and each one of us is distinctive, and we make the whole possible.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Gary.
I'm muted by the host, it says.
I can hear
No, we
you.
can hear you.
Okay, good. Now I'm unmuted, so that's okay. I was just overwhelmed in a way listening to this presentation about your understanding of the best parts of life that you expressed so well in many different ways. I have to attribute some of that to your mom and your dad, having known them and the kind of people they are. But a lot has been your individual experience too, which has given you, which I consider to be insight into the best part of life. I wished that our daughter's families were here to listen to it as well, because I can't think of a presentation that would be better for a family that cares to listen to. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much. But you know, the church community has always been my sanctuary. One of the hardest things about living with a disability is when people look right through you, or even worse, when they look at you with disgust. And growing up, there was always one place where everyone looked at me like a child. And then as I grew up, a teenager and an adult, and I can't tell you how important that has been for me, because I can go out into a world where people look at me differently because I know that that's not the way that everyone looks at me. And as a child, that was especially just so important for me, that every Sunday I knew that I could go somewhere where I would be treated as a kid. And I know people with disabilities that are really smart, that haven't been able to pursue their educational dreams because they just couldn't deal with those looks every day. And so I couldn't have done that without this community and the people that I grew up around, and my mentors today. It took a village to raise me, and so thank you for giving me credit, but a lot of it goes to the people in my life, because there's always been more people who sought to rise me up than drag me down. And I remember I gave a lecture once, and this guy stood up and he said, what does it feel like to be the most unlucky person in the world? And I was shocked by the question, because I had never considered it. The thought had never crossed my mind, because I think that I'm extremely fortunate and extremely lucky to have been able to grow up and to be around the people that I've gotten to have in my life. My dad once told me, I asked him, why did you become a teacher? And he told me that's what matters in life, is people and the next generation. And he told me that that his students, that he felt that they had this God-given talent to create, and he was helping to bring that out and to bring their strength. And it was art that helped my dad realize his value, and that he wasn't dumb. And so he wanted to give other kids, other students, that same gift. And I think that that's really the point of life, is to heal the planet and to help people.
Thank you.
Does anybody have anything else that they'd like to ask or say? Or
Say, Matt,
yeah,
just like to say that we've really enjoyed
Oh,
your
yeah,
presentation.
thank you.
It was like so many of the other ones that you've given in the past. Very enlightening and very down to the basics of what life is about. And just thank you for reminding us all.
Thank you very much. Well, there are many things that I've learned through talking with all of you, and you know, I just really appreciate all of you.
So Matt, this is Kenwin speaking.
Yes.
You know probably what I'm going to say, but I'll say it anyway. I think this is probably one of the occasions in human history where your voice is more needed than ever. This notion about there being physical disabilities and hidden disabilities, the reality is that every one of us right at this particular moment has a hidden disability. And we all have the capacity to be either stigmatizers or to be stigmatized with the constant concern about, gee, is this person going to give me the virus or not give me the virus? And I think that the more that you're able to speak from that deep, deep place to this age, that we will all benefit greatly. As you know, one of the things I've appreciated the most about you is when I've had you with me in educational settings, reminding us that we all have abilities and have disabilities. But as you put so crisply for us today, that it is in our disabilities, in our brokenness, that the divine seems to be revealed to us more clearly. And if ever we wanted an image of the wounded healer, it's always the notion of opening our hearts to our own woundedness and to other people's woundedness that actually produces that transformative dynamic. But the thing I wanted to say to you, and appreciate it as much as expressing my appreciation for your very existence, let alone your way of being, is that I think your voice at this particular stage needs to be loud and clear for the prophetic impact will come much more potently from somebody who's lived the kind of journey you have. So for me, at least today, my appreciation for your very being.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you,
And
Ken.
you've always been an amazing mentor to me. And so thank you for all your support and all that you've taught me.
Matt, can you hear me?
Yes.
I just want to thank you. You talk about all the people that have helped and mean to you. I just want to say it takes 40 seconds of talking to you, and I did last week, and my perspective changed. There's some depth, there's some incredible thing in you that that we need, and that you give, and that you are. And I'm very thankful that I showed up today, and I know others do too. But I'm very, very grateful for who you are. And you talked about being church in a moment in time when a lot of us were wondering, how do we be church? And in a moment when I didn't know if what we were doing meant anything. And I just thank you for that. And if you could say something prophetic about what it means for Ocean Heights Presbyterian Church, what we do, who we are, how we make our welcome more than just words. You have already, but tell us more if you want to, please.
Sure. Well, I think we share each other's stories, but we don't kind of walk in someone else's shoes, right? So I have an incredible karate teacher, and he's blind. And I asked him, how do you teach? How do you know where people are? And he said that each person, he hears the pattern of their uniform, and it's distinctive for each person. And so he knows if somebody's kicking high enough or doing the right kind of move just by that, and so he can echolocate. He uses sound to see. And so he described when it was raining and just the world that he could see from the sound of the vibration of the rain. And it was such a beautiful experience that I got to share when he shared his reality with me. And so I think that if we can try and share each other's realities, that it can really enrich our lives. And I'm somebody who's not really all about trying to convert people. I think that when we try and convert people, that we tend to become manipulative, and that if instead we come and listen to people and learn about their reality, that can enrich our own experience. And like I said, I mean, the Ocean Heights Presbyterian Church and the Pleasantville Presbyterian Church, for that, has always been a sanctuary. And so I think if you start with sanctuary and welcome people, and you do that every Sunday, the way that you bring in other cultures and other liturgies, and but if we to take kind of the next step and actually try to bring some of other people's experiences, and that we all have an authentic voice. And I think God loves different paths, and so that we can learn from each other's path. When I was in grad school, I had an internship, and I had to travel a quarter of a mile every time I had to go to the bathroom. And that internship said till they were blue in the face that they wanted me there and they were supportive, but that lack of a wheelchair accessible bathroom spoke volumes. So if we're gonna invite people and experience their experience authentically, then we have to make sure that there aren't barriers, like the physical barriers, but also cultural barriers. My friends and people that I care for deeply sometimes will say ableist things, not because they're not caring or because they're mean, but because that's the way that society has always taught us that we have to think, right? And so if institutions sin, that means that churches sin. And so, dealing with sin involves penance, and repentance is requires honesty, and it's painful. But and I'm just not signaling out our church, but every church, every institution needs to, and every person, I think we really need to evaluate how we see things and how we see others, because we're all have so much more in common, and we all have so much potential, that we need to work to bring that out in us all. Does that answer help? Is that helpful?
Matt, can you hear me?
Yes. Dr.
Wonderful.
Watts.
Oh my goodness. It's been years.
It is wonderful to see what you've become, and it's just very gratifying.
Uh, wonderful to see you.
Thank you for believing in me, doctor.
Oh my.
Miracle worker.
Yep.
Matt,
Belinda.
craft this as a question, but first preface it by saying that hymn that we sang, the last hymn we sang today, always moves me to tears. And so when I came, I was not going to come on today, but your voice is a healing balm.
Mhm.
And it moved me to a different place because I think you represent, in communities that include you, a voice that is so necessary, not just for this time, but for all of your life. And I think that you talked about barriers to inclusion. And the most difficult part, I think, because I have the ability and do at times put up barriers unknowingly to including people. And so could you talk a little bit about the importance of multiple voices to ensure that we don't exclude unconsciously? How do you do that? How do you ensure that you have a community that does that? And when you don't, how do you find people, individuals that bring that perspective that's necessary that doesn't exist within that community?
Well, I think that we all live with legacies. The legacy of slavery, the legacy of subjugation, the way that Jews were treated. I mean, we all descend from a legacy of injustice and discrimination, and I think we first have to acknowledge that. Um, the frustrating thing for me is when I talk to really kind and good people who tell me that they couldn't possibly be biased against me because they're a good person and that they care about people.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the first step is understanding that you can be a wonderful person and deeply caring and still hold beliefs and ideas and ways of seeing things that are an artifact of times where we didn't have that kind of understanding, right? And so I think we need to start from the place of I am biased, right? I might not know in every way that I am biased, but I am biased, and so I'm gonna challenge my preconceived notions about people, and I'm gonna ask them questions. Um, that's why I love being a therapist because I get to learn about the human condition, one client, one couple at a time. And they teach me about what it means to be a human being. And I hope it opens me up to being less biased. But I try to start from a place of I am biased because I descend from a legacy that 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 imprinted that on me subconsciously, if that makes sense. And then I think people whose voice has been denied, we need to not only invite them into the conversation and ask them for their voice, but then to support them in that. I think far too often people who represent a different way of being or a different understanding share that understanding, and then they're criticized for it or resented because they brought to light something that others would have rather kept hidden and not dealt with. So I think we have to have that safety for people who are vulnerable because they've been historically vulnerable and they're vulnerable today. And unfortunately, as a person with a disability, there are many things in society that, from my perspective, are there to dehumanize me, right? And so I think a lot of people who come from marginalized identities, they experience things in society on a daily basis that tries to take their dignity and that dehumanizes them. And that we have to actively work against that as humanity so that everyone feels that they have dignity and that they matter and that they're important.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. I think that the need to actively work against the tide, if you will, the muck in the swimming pool that we all swim in, and unknowingly look for the hurdles that we put up for people to enter our lives, is important. And asking questions and not being afraid to have the difficult conversations. But we don't know what we don't know. That for me is my biggest challenge, not knowing what I don't know. And sometimes being fearful of asking the question. So, and sometimes being fearful about hearing the answer. So it is a struggle always to create community anywhere. But living in a time where our communities are so homogeneous, where they are stagnant, that it's really difficult. And the pandemic, where we are in time, only has increased that people have gone to their own corners. And so it's really thinking about ways to, in this environment and that which we will create afterwards, how do we, and I think you spoke to this, but, and I'm still challenged, and I guess I will always be challenged. I guess we will always be challenged about how to create community in a environment that does not respect community in the real sense of the word community. So I guess it's always going to be a challenge. But like I said today, your voice is a healing voice.
Thank you.
It's a healing voice, and it's a voice of repeatedly of hope. And I think that that's part of what provides the salve. It did for me today. It did for me today, and thank you.
Thank you. I think it's crucial to always have hope, and faith has gotten me through many times. You know, my faith in a better day, but also my faith in my fellow human beings, and that people like Dr. Watts would come up with a solution because they care and they're committed. And I believe that the only way that we're going to get out of this situation that we're in is through interconnectedness, right? And the virus, now we're trying to stay physically distant, but that, you know, maybe we can realize that the connections of our minds and our spirits and our hearts are much more important than being physically close. And I think that, you know, it's going to take an international effort of people all around the world from all walks of life to defeat this virus, right? You look at all the essential workers who are risking their lives so that we can have food and transportation and all those things. We need to make sure that they have PPE, right? You can't just say, I support the doctors, when we're not then giving them the equipment that they need to be safe. And so I think that you're seeing a difference. You know, I don't want to get political today, but in the way that certain views of this, of individual, and I don't need to wear a mask because I'm tougher than the virus, and people who realize that when I wear the mask, I'm protecting my neighbors, I'm protecting my family members. And so I think that, you know, the rugged individualism is not going to work anymore, and that we have to recognize that we're all interconnected. And not only are we relying on scientists and medical personnel, but we're relying on, you know, every worker and it really shows how interconnected we truly are, and we can't turn away from that. We need to embrace that, and we need to learn from each other, and we need to learn that everyone in this country has a dignified job, or a life that they can be proud of, because it makes our lives better.
Hey, Matt.
Hey,
Uh,
how you doing, Uncle Tom?
I'm doing good. You look like you're doing good.
Thanks.
So, Matt, I'm thinking about Kenwin's comment about your voice and where your voice is needed, the value of your voice. So, what I'm thinking about is, I remember you telling me a story when you first started to work with kids and pain at Children's. They looked at you and their defenses came down. They knew you were one of them. Your voice is particularly powerful in that place. So if I think about your story about giving help and getting help, my guess is there's a lot of those kids that come to feel terrible about asking for help. I think they can't possibly understand the gift that they give to someone by allowing them to help them, right?
Yeah.
So I'm wondering whether or not there could be a lovely short piece just about that on video that could be circulated in places like our children's hospitals, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're connected in Philly. Kaya runs the joint in Detroit. You got some people on this call who could help you shape that message, right?
Mm-hmm.
Short, sweet, and distributed widely. Not only do I think it could help those kids, but I think it could help all those medical personnel who would also hear that. So, a thought for a Sunday.
That's a great idea. Thank you. And I'll definitely pursue that. Thanks.
Tom and Matt, I can't help but jump in here. Let's encourage you to take it a whole other level. Rather than just having your voice, how about you mentor a bunch of 20 kids with massive diversity, be it in the United States or around the world, and have their voices talking about what their experience is like, both asking for help and giving help. I mean, I think, Tom, you're onto something, but I just think if you could be the mentor for others to express their vulnerability, would just be magical. And in the spirit of a little child, will guide them. I think that the adults who hear kids speaking this way would be a huge gift. So if you need any help, I'm waiting.
That sounds like a great idea. Let's do that.
I couldn't agree more.
I remember one time I was at CHOP and I was with Rocky, and he started pulling me, and I didn't know where he was going, but Rocky and I and my service dog had been together long enough that I knew that in these moments just to go with him. And he took me to the oncology wing in CHOP. And then we got in the main hallway, and he just stopped and he stood there. And I looked down at Rocky like, what are we doing, Rocky? We're just standing here. This is not where I have an appointment. And then all of a sudden, all these children started coming out of their room. And they came and they started petting Rocky. And then their parents started crying, and they were thanking me because they said, this is the first time my child has gotten out of bed in months. This is the first time I saw my child smile in months. right?
Rocky.
Because of Rocky. And so that Rocky really taught me how to be with kids and how to engage them because somehow he just knew when people needed him, and he was there.
You're making us cry. We can't take much more.
Well, when I talk about Rocky, it doesn't take much for me to cry. He was an incredible spirit, and just God definitely worked through Rocky.
That's for sure.
So I mean, that's why I'm so thankful is I've had all these incredible relationships in my life, and I plan on continuing to have all these amazing relationships, and that's why I've always considered myself lucky and fortunate because of all of you. Yes.
Matt?
Yes,
Oh,
Uncle John.
hi. Um, as you know, the others may not, I've known you your whole life. Your dad was a brother to me. We grew up together. I just want to, I guess, second what Tom and what Kerwin was saying, that you do have a voice that needs to be heard. And I mean, every time I listen to you, I'm just blown away. And so I just want to encourage you to keep moving forward, keep that message out there, because it's a message of hope, of inclusion, of connection. It's a voice that we need to be hearing all the time, but particularly now when we seem to be living in a very fragmented society. So, keep up the good work. I'm blessed to have you as a friend.
Oh, you too, John.
Yeah.
And we'll talk more offline here.
Okay.
Thank you, Uncle John.
Thank you.
Hi, I was wondering, your actually sermon, your speech was so wonderful. I just wondered if it says record at the corner, and at the part where you're giving your testimony, not necessarily all of ours talking back and forth, but is that possible for that to be a link that we can use that, to have, so we can share with people who weren't blessed to have heard you?
I am recording. I've recorded this whole thing except for maybe the first minute of Matt's talking. And after today, we'll review this, and with Matt's permission, we'll, in one way or another, make it available as a link for the recording if Matt agrees.
I would love that.
Whether it's the whole thing, because the recording has been running since the beginning, or just a shortened version of it, we'll figure that out.
Thank you.
Thank
That
you,
would be
Alice.
wonderful. Thank you, Alice.
Thank you.
Well, it's about lunchtime.
Yeah.
Is there anything else anybody wants to say to Matt, or anything you want to finish with, Matt?
Well, I just want to reiterate that you are all amazing and you are all unique. And I am so thankful and grateful to get to learn and to know all of you. So thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for being you and being such incredible people and doing what you do every day in your lives and contributing to the world. And so thank you. And I would just like to read just a psalm, Psalm 139, if it's okay. God, it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works that I know very well. My frame was not hidden from you. When I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth, your eyes beheld my unformed substance. In your books were written all the days that were formed for me, when none of them yet existed.
And all of God's people say amen.
Amen.
Even the ones we can't see. We hear you, and we're so very grateful for all of you coming. And Matt, especially you, thank you for persevering and getting this going. We greatly thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you,
Matt.
Matt.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much.
It was wonderful.
Love you, Matt.
I love all of you. Thank you.
That's awesome.